Welcome to boring pastimes, where history slows down to a quiet rhythm, perfect for drifting into sleep. Tonight, we'll travel back to the Old West, not the world of outlaws and duels, but the long-forgotten details of ordinary life. Together, we'll explore the dust, the hunger, the illnesses, and the endless silence of the frontier. Settle in, close your eyes, and let the boring history of survival carry you gently into dreams. Story 1. The Dust and the Distance. Surviving travel on the Western trails. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of a wagon train in the mid-1800s, perhaps in Independence, Missouri, one of the classic starting points for the long march westward. Around you are families loading wooden carts, checking oxen harnesses, and stacking supplies. Barrels of flour, boxes of bacon, sacks of cornmeal, crates of tools, and bundles of clothing. The air is not filled with gunshots or dramatic duels, as later Hollywood films might suggest. Instead, it smells of dust, manure, and sweat. What lies ahead is not a land of sudden action, but of monotonous distance, weeks, even months of slow progress across plains, mountains, and deserts. To survive a single day on this trail is no small matter. Even standing here at the beginning, you would feel the weight of the journey, the sheer number of hours spent walking beside animals, the endless creak of wooden wheels, the stifling heat of summer, or the biting chill of spring mornings. By nightfall, your feet would already be blistered, your hands raw from handling ropes, and your body weary from carrying water buckets or lifting wooden crates. But the true difficulty is not just physical, it is logistical. The trails were an endless equation of food versus time, distance versus weather, and luck versus preparation. Most people today might imagine you could just ride in the wagon, but the truth was that wagons were not comfortable vehicles. They were not stagecoaches padded with velvet. They were wooden boxes with iron-rimmed wheels. Sitting inside was rougher than walking. Every bump on the rutted ground could toss passengers around like beans in a tin pan. For this reason, most travelers, even children, walked beside the wagons instead. A day's progress averaged no more than 10 to 15 miles. That distance, which could be driven in 20 minutes by modern car, took every waking hour of the day to cover. Wagons rolled out at dawn, usually after a breakfast of cornmeal mush or coffee, and kept moving until dusk. Travelers trudged in line, breathing dust kicked up by the animals ahead. Imagine inhaling that dust for hours, your throat parched, your eyes stinging, and your skin layered with fine grit that never seemed to wash away. Even with a full day's effort, you would collapse at night, having gone only a fraction of the way toward your destination. And that is where the real mental challenge of the trail began. The endless monotony of knowing how far there was yet to go. The burden of supplies every step westward was shadowed by the constant fear of running out. A typical family wagon might carry 2,000 pounds of supplies, including flour, bacon, dried beans, rice, and coffee. There were also medical kits, clothing, ammunition, and tools. Yet even with careful planning, supplies were always precarious. Flour spoiled, bacon went rancid, sacks tore open and spilled in the dust. Water was the most pressing concern. Each adult needed about a gallon a day in the heat, but wagons could not carry enough barrels to last the entire journey. Travelers depended on rivers, streams, and occasional wells along the way. This meant a single misjudgment of distance or a drought along the route could turn the trail into a death sentence. Many diaries from the Oregon Trail record the quiet terror of thirst, with travelers describing dry creek beds, dead livestock, and desperate searches for muddy water. The boredom of travel was often interrupted by small disasters. A wheel might crack, an axle might splinter, or an ox might collapse from exhaustion. Each failure meant hours or even days of delay, repairs done by hand with the few tools carried. Imagine trying to lift a wagon wheel in the hot sun, your back aching, while others held animals at bay. There was no mechanic to call, no replacement parts waiting at the next stop, only what you carried or could scavenge. The constant march to keep pace. You would wake before dawn. Morning began with the sound of someone blowing a horn or ringing a small bell. Fires were rekindled, coffee boiled, and bacon fried in iron pans, blackened with soot. The taste of breakfast was never indulgent. It was fuel, not pleasure. Soon after, animals were yoked, and the long line of wagons creaked forward. The rest of the day passed in sameness, boots dragging through dirt, oxen groaning, children whining, the sun climbing overhead. Some kept diaries, and reading them today gives a sense of how dull yet relentless the march felt. Entries often describe nothing more than the distance covered, the weather, and whether anyone fell ill. To modern readers, these notes may seem uneventful, but for those on the trail, these details were everything. A storm could stall progress. A sick child could halt the group. A broken yoke could mean falling behind. Lunch was usually taken cold, and quickly. Hard bread, perhaps a slice of salt pork, maybe a piece of dried fruit if one had been saved. There was little rest. By afternoon, feet swelled, backs stiffened, and tempers flared. Small arguments over pace, chores, or resources sometimes grew heated, but they had to be set aside. The wagon train depended on order. 4 stragglers were vulnerable to exhaustion or illness. By evening, fires were built again. Wagons drawn into a circle, not for defense, despite the myths, but for convenience. Animals were corralled inside or tied near the camp. Supper might be stew if someone had the energy, but often it was more bread and bacon. As the night fell, the stars appeared brilliant above the open plains, but to the weary traveler they were little comfort. You would lay on a thin blanket or crude mattress, body aching, dust still clinging to your skin, knowing tomorrow would be exactly the same dot. The question of endurance what strikes you most about this first day is not the excitement of adventure but the crushing routine. To survive, you would need not just food and water, but patience, the kind of patience that carries you through weeks of the same view, the same chores, the same exhaustion. It is tempting to imagine the Wild West as a place of sudden drama, gunfights, ambushes, or treasures found. But the truth, at least here on the trail, was different. The West tested people, not with bursts of action, but with endurance. It was the monotony that broke many, the grinding distance that wore them down day after day. So, as the first night settles in, and the wagon train prepares for another dawn, you might ask yourself, how many more days like this could you truly endure before the promise of the West began to feel like a burden rather than a dream? The second day on the trail begins, much like the first, with the clatter of pans, the sound of voices rousing children from sleep, and the slow groan of oxen being yoked to the wagons. Yet as the miles stretch into weeks, the challenges of the road begin to show their true weight. You discover quickly that the journey west was never about a single dramatic obstacle, but a long accumulation of small failures, wooden wheels splintering, animals faltering, tempers fraying, and bodies succumbing to exhaustion. These ordinary setbacks defined the frontier, testing patience more than courage. When we imagine a wagon train, we might picture a neat line of white canvas tops rolling smoothly across open plains. The reality was far rougher. Wheels sank into mud, wagons tipped into ruts, and iron rims split apart from constant friction. Every few days, someone's wagon broke down, bringing the entire company to a halt, and there was no guarantee that it could be fixed. Tools were few, spare parts even fewer. Many wagons were mended with strips of leather, bundles of rope, or pieces of scavenged wood. The creak of a damaged axle became the soundtrack of progress. If your wagon broke beyond repair, the decision was brutal: abandon goods or abandon hope. Some families reduced their loads by tossing out furniture, heirlooms, even food. Diaries from the trail often record the strange sight of items scattered along the roadside: a chest of drawers, a spinning wheel, sometimes even a Bible, all too heavy to carry further. What once seemed precious became useless in the face of survival. The animals that carried the oxen, mules, and horses that pulled these wagons were as vital as any tool, yet they, too, suffered. Oxen were preferred for their strength and endurance, but they moved slowly and were prone to sore hooves and swollen joints. Every step they took was in dust or mud, their hides streaked with sweat, their ribs showing. As rations thinned, if an animal collapsed, there was little that could be done. Shooting a sick ox was sometimes the only option, leaving families stranded unless others shared their teams. Travelers often wrote about the sadness of losing animals, for they were not simply beasts of burden, but companions in hardship. One diary entry mourned the loss of a mule, as if a neighbor had died, a reflection of how closely survival was tied to these creatures. For a single day, you might manage without an ox. For a journey of months, it was unthinkable. The slow toll on the body, the human body, also wore down quickly under the grind of the trail. Walking 15 miles a day in rough boots led to blistered feet, swollen ankles, and aching backs. Sunburn, cracked skin, while dust-coated mouths and throats, and there was no escape from the elements. On hot days, the sun beat down mercilessly. On cold nights, frost formed on blankets. Meals gave little relief. The diet, though heavy in bulk, lacked freshness. Salt pork, biscuits, and beans were filling but monotonous. Fresh vegetables and fruit were scarce, and soon scurvy began to show its signs: bleeding gums, loose teeth, and fatigue. Some wagon trains stopped at trading posts or forts to purchase supplies, but prices were high and availability uncertain. Illness spread easily. Dysentery, cholera, and measles were common. A single sick traveler could infect dozens. The wagons, though open, became crowded places where germs lingered. Imagine tending to a feverish child by the side of a dusty trail without medicine beyond a bottle of castor oil or a pouch of dried herbs. Death was not dramatic, but quiet and frequent. Graves dotted the route, marked with wooden boards or simple piles of stone. The strain on the mind, if the body suffered, so too did the mind. Monotony was its own kind of trial. Day after day, the scenery changed little. Plains rolled endlessly, the horizon flat and unbroken. Travelers spoke of the silence, interrupted only by the creak of wagons and the bellow of oxen. Without books, newspapers, or diversions, evenings stretched long and empty. Arguments grew common. Families quarreled over pace, chores, or lost possessions. Groups disagreed on routes or resting points. Some companies split apart entirely, unable to keep unity in the face of constant frustration. The dream of the West often dimmed long before the journey was halfway done. What began as hope slowly turned into endurance, and then into resignation. Moments of respite yet, even in this monotony, there were small moments that broke the rhythm. A river crossing, for instance, was both dreaded and remembered. Wagons had to be ferried across, floated on makeshift rafts, or forded through rushing water. Clothes were soaked, supplies damaged, and sometimes lives lost in the attempt. But once across, the company would camp together, drying clothes, sharing stories, and feeling for a brief time a sense of triumph. There were also encounters with strangers, trappers, traders, or native tribes. Some offered goods, others warnings. To a weary traveler, these meetings were moments of variety in an otherwise endless march. A scrap of news from the East, a glimpse of a different way of life, or even a shared meal could become a memory that endured longer than the dust and the distance. The burden of the unfinished journey, as weeks dragged on, it became clear to many that the greatest challenge was not the difficulty of a single day, but the thought of how many more lay ahead. Each broken wheel, each night of poor sleep, each argument or sickness was not an isolated event but part of a long chain. Hope had to stretch thinly over hundreds of miles yet to come. For you, walking beside a wagon under the hot sun, there would be no clear sense of progress. The land ahead always looked the same. The destination lay not just miles away but months. And so the question was not whether you could survive a day, but whether you could survive the endless repetition of days that wore down wagons, animals, and spirits alike. The open question as night falls again, campfires flicker across the plain. You eat your bread and beans, listen to the animals shifting restlessly, and look at the stars. Tomorrow will be the same as today, and the next day after that. So you begin to wonder, at what point does the promise of a better life in the West stop outweighing the exhaustion, the losses, and the quiet despair of the trail itself? The long journey west did not end with a single triumphant moment, as many might imagine. Instead, it ended the same way it had begun. Slowly, warily, and often with more questions than answers. For months, you had trudged beside wagons, counted the rations, repaired broken axles, buried the dead, and endured the monotony of endless miles. And now, finally, you glimpse the faint outline of mountains, or the low valley where your new settlement will begin. But what does arrival really mean? It is not a town waiting with open arms. It is not a farm already plowed or a house already built. Arrival meant only that the walking had stopped. The hardships, in a sense, had just begun. The last miles those who made it west often described the final days with a mixture of relief and disbelief. After months of repetition, The idea that the journey had an end was almost impossible to grasp. One diary records the words, "I cannot believe we have stopped moving." Travelers were so conditioned to the rhythm of packing, walking, and camping that stillness felt unnatural. But the last miles were also the hardest. Supplies were nearly gone, animals worn to bone and hide. Families staggered into their destinations, with clothes tattered, bodies thinner, and tempers frayed. Children had outgrown the shoes they started with, forcing some to walk barefoot over rocky ground. By the end, there was little left to give. The West was not waiting when you finally stepped down from the trail. There was no guarantee of reward. The land was not empty. It was a place already inhabited by native peoples, wildlife, and sometimes other settlers. Claims had to be staked, farms carved out, cabins raised. For many, the first night at journey's end was spent under the same canvas cover of the wagon, with the same dry bread and beans for supper. The myth of instant success vanished quickly. Gold was not lying in rivers, crops did not grow overnight, and towns were not built in days. The West demanded the same endurance as the trail, only in a new form. To survive, you needed to build shelter before winter, plant crops before the soil froze, and find water before your barrels ran dry. For those who imagined the journey was the hardest part, the truth was sobering. The cost of the journey is important to understand what had been lost along the way. Every wagon train left graves behind. Hundreds of thousands of travelers never reached their destination. Cholera was the most notorious killer, its outbreaks sweeping through camps with terrifying speed. A person could feel well in the morning and be buried by evening. Others died of accidents, crushed by wagons, drowned in rivers, or killed by simple infections that turned deadly without modern medicine. For every family that arrived together, another arrived missing someone. Diaries speak of mothers carrying the memory of a child buried in a shallow grave on the prairie, or fathers who had to carry on after losing a partner. Arrival was bittersweet, shadowed by absence. The landscape of settlement now. Imagine standing in the place where your wagon stops for the last time before you stretch plains, or perhaps the edge of a forest, or the slope of a valley. It is quiet, vast, and intimidating. This is your new world. But what do you actually have? You have tools, if they survived the journey. You have a wagon, perhaps, now too battered to move again. You have seeds, if they were not spilled or eaten along the way. You have little food, for the journey consumed most of it. And you have your body, tired, thin, blistered, but still alive. The first tasks were always the same: water, shelter, food. Wells had to be dug, sod cut, 4 walls, fields cleared of stone and brush. Families slept in wagons until cabins were raised. Neighbors were scarce, sometimes miles away. For many, the isolation was the greatest trial. The endless days of the trail, at least, had been spent in company. Now you were left in silence, with only the wind for a voice. The emotional shift. The promise of the West had carried people across rivers, deserts, and mountains. But once arrived, many felt something unexpected: disappointment. The land was harder than they imagined, the labor greater, and the reward slower to appear. One settler wrote bitterly, "The West is not what the papers told us it would be." And yet people endured. They built cabins out of sod, dug cellars to store what little food they could grow, and raised fences from sticks and wire. They worked not for excitement, but for survival. Each day was a continuation of the trail, just in a different form, repetitive, backbreaking, and demanding endless patience. The trail's true lesson, looking back, it becomes clear that the journey west was not just about distance, it was about transformation. Those who survived were not the same as those who began. They had been hardened by dust, by hunger, by the monotony of the road. They had learned to throw away what was unnecessary, to endure what seemed unendurable, and to keep moving even when hope seemed far away. The West was not about grand adventures or quick fortunes. It was about ordinary persistence. It was about enduring blisters, mending wagons, burying the dead, and still walking forward. It was, above all else, about patience. The open reflection. So, you ask yourself, if you had walked beside those wagons, endured the dust and the distance, and finally arrived at this quiet, empty patch of land, would you have had the strength to begin all over again, to turn wilderness into home? Or would the reality of arrival, so much duller and harsher than the dream, have broken your spirit at last? Story 2. Wells, Water, and Want, the endless thirst of the frontier. When you think of the American West, you might picture wide skies, open plains, and endless horizons. But there is one detail that is often forgotten in these sweeping images: water. Out on the prairies and deserts, water was not merely a convenience, it was survival itself. And unlike the modern world, where taps and pipes make water feel plentiful and guaranteed, the settlers of the frontier lived in a constant state of thirst, counting every drop, measuring every barrel, and worrying endlessly about where the next sip might come from. Imagine walking through the tall grasses of Kansas or Nebraska in midsummer. The land is vast, the horizon far away, and the sun overhead offers no mercy. The air is dry, the wind hot, and the ground beneath your boots crunches with dust. You reach for your water flask and find it nearly empty, the leather skin warm too. The touch, you take a swallow, but it brings little comfort. Around you, your wagon train plods forward, each creak of the wheels and bellow of the oxen reminding you that they too need water, and far more than you. This was the daily reality of crossing the plains. The human body could endure hunger for days, even weeks, but without water, survival dwindled quickly. Dehydration brought dizziness, headaches, cramps, and confusion. For animals, the need was even greater. Oxen and mules required gallons each day, and without them, wagons could not move. To be caught without water was not just uncomfortable, it was deadly. Rivers and the mirage of abundance. At the start of the journey, rivers seemed plentiful. The Missouri, the Platte, the Arkansas, names that appear again and again in the journals of westward travelers. These waterways were the lifelines of the trail, guiding wagons along their banks. But even these rivers posed challenges. The Platte River, for example, was notorious, described as a mile wide and an inch deep. It provided water that was often murky, filled with silt and foul-tasting. One traveler wrote that drinking from it was like swallowing liquid mud. Livestock often balked at it, refusing to drink. Boiling it for coffee made only a bitter sludge. Yet people had no choice. They scooped it into barrels, strained it through cloth, and drank what they could. Other rivers ran fast and dangerous. Crossing them risked wagons overturning, goods floating away, and people drowning. Even when safely crossed, the water itself was sometimes contaminated. Dead animals upstream could foul a river for miles. Settlers spoke of seeing carcasses of oxen or horses in the water, bloated and drifting, while others still filled their barrels out of necessity. To drink was to risk sickness, but not drinking was to risk death. The labor of wells on the open plains, rivers often disappeared. When none were in sight, the only option was to dig. Wells were not neat stone circles, with pulleys, as you might imagine from movies, but shallow pits dug desperately into the earth in search of damp soil. Families would take turns with shovels, sometimes digging all night. If lucky, they found water only a few feet down. If unlucky, they dug 10 feet, 20, or more, and still struck dust. Those who traveled the trails often marked good water, spots for others. A reliable spring or a small creek became known across generations of travelers, noted in guidebooks, and passed along by word of mouth. Yet even then, drought could make them vanish. Imagine reaching a spot famous for its clear spring only to find a cracked bed of dry stone. The disappointment was crushing. The economy of water was scarce. It became a kind of currency. At trading posts and small settlements, barrels of water were sometimes sold for prices higher than food. Travelers wrote of paying several cents for a single bucket, a sum that might feed a family on bread for a day. On cattle drives, water rights were fiercely contested. Ranchers built windmills and dug reservoirs, charging drovers for access. Disputes often arose over whose herd had the right to drink first. To be denied water was to risk losing hundreds of cattle, and by extension, a man's livelihood. In towns, wells became central gathering places. People lined up with buckets, gossiping while waiting their turn. In the dry season, tempers could flare. Those who used too much were resented. Those with deeper wells became powerful figures. In some communities, disputes over water access were as bitter as any political quarrel. Water and disease scarcity was not the only problem. What water settlers did find was often unsafe. Without understanding of germs, they drank from stagnant pools, muddy rivers, and shallow wells contaminated by animal waste. Cholera, dysentery, and typhoid spread quickly through wagon trains and towns alike. Cholera, in particular, haunted the trails. Outbreaks struck with terrifying speed. A person could be well in the morning, stricken by cramps and vomiting by midday, and dead by nightfall. The disease spread through contaminated water, and once it appeared, fear spread faster than the illness itself. Graves marked cholera victim lined the Oregon Trail in the 1840s and 1850s. Families tried to protect themselves in small ways. They boiled water when they had enough firewood. They strained it through cloth to remove visible dirt. Even mixed it with whiskey or coffee, believing it might kill whatever caused illness. But these efforts rarely worked. To drink was always to take a risk. The emotional weight of thirst, perhaps the most overlooked part of this struggle, was the constant worry. To live on the frontier meant living with thirst as a daily shadow. Even when you had water, you worried about when it would run out. Each sip was taken carefully, measured against the distance ahead. Parents rationed their children's cups, watching them cry with thirst, unable to give more. Animals lowed in the heat, tongues lolling, their need plain to see. Imagine lying down at night with your lips cracked, your throat dry, and your stomach aching for water. Sleep did not come easily, for your mind counted the gallons left, the distance to the next river, the number of animals that needed drinking. And in the morning, the fear began again. The open question. By now, you begin to see how survival in the West was not decided by courage or skill with a gun, but by something far duller, the ability to find and ration water. It was not the dramatic moments that decided who lived and who died, but the quiet calculation of how many days a barrel might last. And so you wonder, if faced with the endless thirst of the plains, would you have had the patience and restraint to survive, or would fear and desperation have driven you to drink your share too soon? The settlers who crossed the plains or tried to build homes in the West quickly learned a simple truth. Water was never guaranteed. A creek that flowed in spring might dry to a trickle in summer. A well that once yielded a steady supply might collapse or sour. And when the skies withheld rain, there was nothing to do but wait. Wait with dust in your throat, parched lips, and livestock groaning with thirst to us. Drought is often a distant idea, measured in news reports and statistics, but for families living on the edge of survival, drought was immediate and personal. Each day without rain was a reminder that the fields would fail. The animals might die, and the barrels beside the house would grow lighter. The frontier was not only a place of distance and dust, but of constant calculation. How long could one stretch a bucket? How far could one drive animals before they collapsed? How many days could a child survive on half rations of water? The cycles of droughts, the plains were unpredictable. Some years brought too much rain, flooding creeks and soaking wagon trains to misery. Other years brought nothing at all. The sky would remain clear for weeks, the sun a relentless presence, the ground cracking open, grass withered, crops failed, dust rose with every step. Settlers who came from wetter regions of the East were unprepared for these extremes. In diaries and letters, many described their astonishment at how quickly the land turned dry. One farmer in Kansas wrote, "The rain came in April, and we thought the Lord had blessed us. By June, the ground was like powder, and our corn burned brown before our eyes." For wagon trains, drought meant death along the roadside. Horses, mules, and oxen sometimes collapsed, tongues swollen, bodies unable to continue. Travelers recorded the grim sight of carcasses lining the trail, each one a silent warning that the water ahead might not be enough. Families were forced to abandon wagons when animals died, carrying only what they could on their backs. Disease in the water even. When water was found, it carried its own dangers. Without understanding of bacteria, settlers often drew from stagnant pools or shallow wells polluted by waste. The result was sickness that spread through entire communities. Cholera was the most feared. The disease followed the major trails, striking wagon trains with terrifying speed. One record from 1849 described how dozens of graves were dug in a single week along a stretch of the Platte River. Families traveling west often passed fresh mounds of dirt and hastily carved wooden markers, each one a reminder of how fragile survival could be. Typhoid and dysentery were also common. Contaminated water led to fevers, stomach cramps, and relentless diarrhea that drained the body of strength. In the crowded conditions of a wagon train or a small frontier town, one infected barrel could sicken dozens. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Some families attempted remedies, boiling water, mixing it with vinegar, or adding whiskey. Others strained it through cloth, or tried to gather rainwater in barrels lined with tar. But these methods were crude and often ineffective. To drink was always a gamble, and many lost. The deadly wait for rain perhaps the cruelest part of drought was its silence. Nothing happened quickly. Days stretched into weeks, each one hotter than the last. Crops wilted slowly, first turning pale, then brown, then collapsing into the dust. Animals grew weaker, their ribs showing, their movements sluggish. People felt it in their bodies. Headaches, parched lips, the dull ache of constant thirst. Families watched the skies with desperation. Each cloud that appeared on the horizon was a source of hope. Children were sent to run inside, calling out that rain was coming. Adults paused their work, staring upward. Sometimes drops did fall, pattering on the roof, darkening the soil. But often it ended as quickly as it began, the ground swallowing the moisture before it could sink in. Hope rose and died in minutes. There were those who tried rituals, prayer meetings that lasted all night, sermons urging repentance, communities gathering to beg for mercy from the heavens. Some even turned to folklore, placing certain herbs on rooftops or ringing bells to call the rain. But the sky did not listen. The land remained dry, the rivers shallow, the wells empty. Conflict over water. When drought lingered, cooperation often gave way to conflict. Neighbors argued over wells. Cattlemen fought with farmers. Some accused others of stealing water at night, sneaking to fill buckets while families slept. Laws were weak, enforcement weaker. The strongest or the most desperate often claimed what they needed. On the trails, fights broke out when one wagon train drained a creek before another could arrive. Families sometimes camped at waterholes, refusing to leave until their barrels were full, while others begged or tried to bargain. The sight of strangers approaching a dwindling supply often filled people with dread, rather than relief. These disputes rarely became the dramatic gunfights of Western legend. More often, they were bitter arguments, long resentments, and silent hostility between neighbors forced to live side by side. Yet, in their own way, they were just as destructive, sowing division in communities that depended on unity. The mental weight of scarcity. To live with constant thirst was not only a physical trial, but a mental one. The body adapts to hunger by dulling its cravings, but thirst gnaws relentlessly. It fills the mind with thoughts of water, dreams of rivers, fantasies of rain. Travelers wrote of seeing mirages in the heat, shimmering lakes that vanished upon approach. These illusions mocked the weary, tempting them to stray from the path in search of water that did not exist. Children cried from thirst, their lips cracking, their voices hoarse. Parents rationed sips, listening to the wails, but refusing more. That kind of restraint left scars, not easily forgotten. To deny your child water was perhaps one of the greatest burdens of frontier life. Yet many had no choice. The open question, by now it becomes clear that life in the West was not defined by daring adventure, but by the dull, endless challenge of waiting. Waiting for clouds to gather, waiting for rain to fall, waiting for a well to fill again. It was not the sudden violence of bandits or beasts that threatened most lives, but the quiet, slow death of thirst. So you must ask yourself, if caught in such a drought, watching the land dry up and the barrels run empty, would you have had the patience to endure, or would despair have broken you long before the rain returned? If there was one truth on the western frontier, it was this: whoever controlled the water controlled survival. The great rivers, shallow wells, and trickling creeks were not just resources, they were lifelines. Without them, the land was uninhabitable. With them, communities could rise, farms could flourish, and cattle could be driven across miles of arid plain. Yet water was always scarce enough to provoke tension. For every settlement that dug a well, there was another neighbor who questioned its depth or its fairness. For every rancher who claimed a riverbank, there was a farmer who needed that same water for his crops. The struggle for water shaped laws, fueled rivalries, and determined who endured and who abandoned the land. The wells beneath the ground digging. A well was one of the first tasks of any settler. With luck, a shallow hole lined with stones might yield a steady trickle. But more often, it required back-breaking work, hours of digging through clay and sand, sometimes to depths of 50 or even 100 feet. Families celebrated when water finally seeped in, muddy at first, then clearer as the days passed. But wells were fickle. They collapsed under their own weight, they dried up in summer, and they could easily be poisoned by waste or seepage. Many families learned this too late, after illness spread through their children or animals fell sick. Neighbors often watched one another closely. A deep well on one homestead could lower the water table for others nearby. Whispered accusations spread. They've stolen the water from under our land. It was not theft in the usual sense, but for desperate people. The difference hardly mattered. Rivers and their masters. For those near rivers, water seemed abundant. The Platte, the Arkansas, the Rio Grande. These names carried the promise of flowing life, but rivers, too, were deceptive. They swelled in spring, overflowing banks, drowning fields, sweeping away wagons. By midsummer, they shrank to sluggish channels, muddy and shallow. Farmers tried to divert river water into ditches. Ranchers drove cattle to drink in herds so large that they churned the banks into mud. Towns built wooden flumes and later crude dams to harness the flow. But with each improvement came disputes. Who had the right to use the water first? Who could divert it, and how much? The law of the East, where rivers ran fuller and land was wetter, proved useless here. In its place grew a rough principle that came to dominate the West: prior appropriation. The first to claim water, the first to build a ditch or flume, had the right to use it. Neighbors who came later found themselves locked out, even if their needs were greater. It was a harsh system, but in the eyes of many settlers, it matched the harshness of the land. The rise of irrigation. Some settlers dreamed not just of survival, but of abundance. If water could be stored, directed, and rationed, the desert might bloom. And so began the slow, difficult experiments with irrigation. Communities in Utah, led by Mormon settlers, were among the first to dig organized canals, sharing the work and the water according to need. Elsewhere, farmers built ditches by hand, guiding water from rivers into fields. These systems often failed, canals collapsed, water evaporated before reaching its destination, or disputes erupted over who deserved more. But each attempt pushed the frontier closer to sustainability. Irrigation changed the land itself. Where once only sagebrush grew, fields of wheat appeared, orchards spread, small towns thrived because of carefully managed ditches. Yet irrigation also deepened divisions. Upstream users often drained rivers before the flow could reach those downstream. Lawsuits, vigilante justice, and even small-scale wars broke out. Water, invisible underground and flowing in rivers, had become the most fought-over commodity in the West. Cattle, crops, and clashing needs. The tension between cattlemen and farmers lay at the heart of water disputes. Ranchers needed open range, vast tracts of land where herds could graze, moving from creek to creek. Farmers needed fences and irrigation, securing every drop for crops. When ranchers drove their herds through farmland, they often trampled ditches, fouled wells, and drained waterholes. Farmers responded by building fences and guarding their land. These conflicts were not always bloody, but they shaped the frontier as surely as any battle. In time, the farmer's claim usually prevailed, for farming anchored families while ranching relied on movement. But the years of hostility left scars and legends of the cattle wars that echoed long after. The government steps in. By the late 19th century, it became clear that private effort alone could not solve the West's water problem. The federal government began surveys, studying rivers and land, planning dams and reservoirs. The great irrigation projects would come later, but their seeds were planted in these years of scarcity. For settlers living day by day, the government's promises meant little. What mattered was the next bucket, the next rain, the next well dug. But from these struggles grew the foundation of modern water law, shaping how the West still divides its rivers and groundwater today. The broader lesson of water. Looking back, one sees that water determined who lived and who left, who prospered and who failed. Many families abandoned their claims after repeated droughts, returning east or drifting into towns. Others endured, learning to ration, to share, or sometimes to steal. The myth of the West is one of open land and endless freedom. The reality was one of dependence on a scarce resource, a constant reminder that human ambition could not bend nature at will. And so the question remains, was the West truly conquered, or was it only endured, shaped not by the dreams of settlers, but by the silent, unyielding power of water itself? Story 3. Dust, Dung, and Daily Chores. The work behind Western survival. When most people imagine the Wild West, they picture shootouts on dusty streets, stagecoaches racing across the plains, or cowboys driving herds under wide skies. But for the overwhelming majority of settlers, the West was not defined by sudden violence or adventure. It was defined by routine, by the slow, repetitive tasks that filled every waking hour, by chores so constant and dull that they became the background rhythm of survival. Every day on the frontier began with work and ended with work. From sunrise to sundown, there was always something to mend, something to clean, something to prepare. To live in the West was to live inside an unbroken chain of chores, each one small, each one necessary, and each one demanding more strength than most could imagine. The morning begins before the sun, before the first streaks of dawn. Families rose from their rough beds. Sleep was not deep. 4 homes were drafty. Mattresses were filled with straw or corn husks, and nights in winter could freeze even under layers of quilts. The first task was fire. Without fire, there was no warmth, no breakfast, no hot water to clean with. The fire had to be coaxed from coals preserved overnight or rekindled with tinder and kindling. Children often carried armfuls of wood or dried dung, buffalo chips, on the plains or cow patties nearer to farms to keep the fire alive through the day. Water came next. In towns, one might fetch it from a communal pump. In remote cabins, it meant a walk to the well, or worse, to the nearest stream. Buckets were heavy, and spills meant another trip. Without water, no other chores could even begin. Feeding the animals were central to survival, and they had to be fed before the family sat down to eat. Chickens squawked for grain, pigs rooted impatiently. Horses and oxen, the engines of transport and plowing, needed hay or grass. In winter, when pasture was scarce, families carried armfuls of feed from stacks stored the previous summer. Each animal required care. Chickens needed eggs collected and coops cleaned. Cows needed to be milked, usually twice a day. Milk soured quickly without refrigeration, so women churned butter regularly to preserve it. Horses had to be brushed, harnessed, and watched for injuries. A lame animal could mean no plowing, no hauling, no travel. These tasks were often given to children, but even then they required discipline. Forgetting to latch a gate or neglecting an animal's feed could cost a family dearly. Meals were labor, not rest. Breakfast itself was a chore. Bread was baked, not in loaves purchased from a store, but in ovens heated with wood or coals. Flour had to be sifted, dough kneaded, and every step done by hand. Eggs, bacon, or porridge required pans scrubbed clean of soot. Coffee, when available, was ground by hand. There was no quick meal, no convenience. Eating was only the end of another chain of tasks: gathering, preparing, cooking, and cleaning before the day's main labor even began. The household chores without end inside the home. Daily life revolved around maintenance. Clothes wore out quickly in the harsh climate. Women spent long hours patching holes, darning socks, or sewing new garments from scraps. Washing was done by hand, with boiling water carried from the fire, soap often made from lye, and laundry beaten or scrubbed against washboards. Floors were swept constantly, not with store-bought brooms, but with brooms made from twigs or straw. Dust seeped through every crack, carried by wind, settling on food, bedding, and clothing. Cleaning was less about tidiness and more about preventing disease or discomfort. Candles had to be made, dipped slowly in tallow. Lamps had to be filled with oil. Barrels of food had to be checked for spoilage. Each task was small, but skipping even one could mean hunger, cold, or sickness later. The children's burden children were not spared these routines. Even the youngest were given tasks: gathering kindling, carrying water, chasing chickens, or scaring away crows from fields. Older children plowed, planted, or helped herd animals. Education, when it came, often fit around chores. A boy might miss school for weeks during planting or harvest. A girl might spend her time at home, sewing or cooking, rather than attending class. Childhood was brief, not because children grew faster, but because necessity made them workers. Almost as soon as they could walk. The dirt that never left, perhaps the most constant companion of the frontier, was dirt. Dust blew across plains, coating everything. Mud clung to boots in spring. Manure littered barnyards and streets alike. People bathed rarely. Water was too precious, heating it too costly. Clothes absorbed smoke, sweat, and dust, and were often worn until threadbare. Settlers simply accepted it. A layer of grime became the natural state of life. Letters from visitors often remarked on the smell of homes, the rough appearance of people, and the ever-present dust. It was not laziness, but the impossibility of keeping clean in such conditions. A cycle without rest. The day was filled with tasks: repairing fences, mending tools, cutting wood, tending crops, grinding grain, preparing meals. Again, each task led into the next, until sundown arrived, and work only slowed, never stopped. Evening meant feeding animals once more, fetching water for night, checking fires, and preparing for yet another dawn. Rest was brief. Families often sat quietly, sewing or whittling by lamplight, reading from the Bible if one was available. Sleep came early, not as leisure, but as necessity for the next day's labor. Life on the frontier was not the romance of adventure, but the monotony of survival. The great battles of the West were not fought with guns, but with buckets, plows, and brooms. And yet, in these endless routines lay the foundation of every town, every farm, every settlement that endured. But the question lingers: how long could a family endure such labor before the weight of monotony became as crushing as hunger itself? When we think of survival in the Wild West, it is easy to imagine the lone pioneer, a rugged figure standing against the wilderness with only grit and determination. But the truth is far more ordinary and far more dependent on others. Survival in the West was rarely achieved alone. It was won through the pooling of labor, through cooperation, and through the shared burdens of dull, repetitive chores. Life was simply too demanding for one family to endure in isolation. Chores reached beyond the walls of a cabin or the fences of a homestead, stretching into the wider circle of neighbors, churches, and towns. Every settlement that lasted did so because people learned that routine labor, even the most boring and thankless of tasks, was easier, and sometimes only possible when shared. The barn raising and communal building, one of the clearest examples of shared work, was the barn raising. For a single family, building a barn might take weeks or months. The cutting of logs, the hauling of timbers, the lifting of beams into place, all were nearly impossible without help. But when a community gathered, a barn could be raised in a single day. Neighbors arrived at dawn, armed with saws, axes, and ropes. Men cut and lifted, women prepared meals, and children fetched water or carried small tools. By evening, a skeleton of a barn stood firm, ready to shelter animals or store crops. The event was more than just construction. It was a ritual of cooperation. Each family took turns hosting one, knowing that their labor would be repaid when their own time came. It was boring, repetitive, and often back-breaking work, but together it became manageable. Harvest time, too much for one family, no task. revealed the limits of isolation more clearly than the harvest. Fields of wheat, corn, or hay ripened all at once. If crops were not cut, bundled, and stored quickly, they could be lost to weather, rot, or animals. Neighbors often joined together to bring in the harvest, moving from farm to farm like an informal army of workers. Scythes swung in rhythm, sheaves were stacked, and wagons rolled to barns. Meals were cooked in large kettles, feeding dozens at once. Harvest time was not glamorous. It was sweat, aching backs, and endless repetition. But without such cooperation, no family could hope to gather their crop in time. A bad harvest meant not just less profit, but the very real threat of hunger in the winter months. Women's work as community work in many towns. Women's chores also extended into communal life. Laundry, for example, was often done together at a stream or communal wash site. Here, women scrubbed clothes on rocks or boards, rinsing them in cold water while sharing news, recipes, or quiet complaints about the monotony of life. Quilting bees were another shared task. Quilts were necessary for warmth in drafty homes, and scraps of fabric were too precious to waste. Women gathered in groups, stitching pieces into patterns, turning the dull labor of sewing into a social event. Each finished quilt carried not only warmth, but the imprint of many hands working together. Candle making, soap boiling, and even the preparation of preserves were sometimes done in groups. These were not luxuries, but necessities, chores, that needed repeating year after year, season after season. Alone, they could feel crushing. Together, they became a rhythm of community. Children in the communal web children also contributed beyond their families. A boy might help a neighbor gather wood or herd cattle. A girl might carry food to a sick neighbor or assist with younger children. These exchanges were rarely formal, but they created a web of obligation that bound families together. Schoolhouses, when they existed, also doubled as places where children's labor indirectly supported communities. In towns, children might be pulled from school to help during planting or harvest, but when classes were in session, they became part of the community's investment in its future. Church, meetings, and chores in disguised churches were not just places of worship, they were centers of organization. Sunday services gathered scattered families into one place, where news was shared, disputes resolved, and future work discussed. A meeting might decide when to dig a communal well, how to repair a road, or who would watch over a widow's land until her children could manage it. Even social gatherings were wrapped around chores. A husking bee, where corn was stripped of its husks, was both work and festivity. Men and women sang songs, told stories, and shared jokes as they worked. The task itself was dull, but the gathering transformed it into an occasion. The dangers of isolation. Communities mattered not just for efficiency, but for survival. A lone family, cut off by distance or weather, faced dangers they could rarely endure alone. Illness could spread quickly without help, leaving crops untended or animals unfed. Accidents, a broken leg, a crushed hand, a snake bite, could render a worker useless for weeks. Without neighbors, such setbacks could spell ruin. Travelers' diaries often recorded the stark difference between isolated homesteads and clustered towns. The lonely farms were described as bleak, weary places where every chore fell heavy on a single family. In contrast, settlements with networks of shared labor seemed sturdier, more hopeful, and more capable of enduring the endless grind. Bonds of obligation shared chores were rarely acts of pure generosity. They created bonds of obligation. If a family skipped a barn raising, they could not expect help at their own. If they failed to send food to a sick neighbor, they might find their own requests ignored. Survival was not only about completing chores, but about maintaining the delicate balance of giving and receiving help. These obligations could feel heavy, but they also built resilience. A community tied together by the dull repetition of labor was harder to break than one bound only by words, a web stronger than any individual over time. These shared chores created a fabric of life in the West. Each stitch, each fence repaired, each bushel carried in by many hands built a sense of belonging stronger than isolation could ever provide. Towns survived not because of gunslingers or outlaws, but because of neighbors who carried buckets, mended tools, and raised barns together. The chores of the West were not heroic in the way stories often tell. They were dull, repetitive, and exhausting, but in their very monotony, they forced people into cooperation. In the end, survival on the frontier was not the story of rugged individuals, but of ordinary people who shared burdens, built communities. And yet, one question lingers in this pattern of cooperation. What happened when communities broke down, when trust failed, and when neighbors turned away from each other in the face of endless labor? When we imagine the West today, we often see the gunfighter, the lawman, or the outlaw riding through dusty streets. Hollywood gave us saloon doors swinging, poker games, and shootouts at high noon. Yet, beneath these dramatic images lies a quieter truth. The legacy of the West was built not by guns, but by chores. The endless repetition of daily labor shaped not only survival in the moment, but the very myths that later grew around the frontier. For while people did not often speak of it, for who brags of carrying water or milking cows, the memory of those chores left deep marks on the culture that followed. The myth of hard work, the West came to symbolize hard work, endurance, and grit. But this was not because of battles or adventure. It was because life demanded work without end. Families who survived the plains, deserts, and mountains did so through a rhythm of chores so constant that it defined their identity. The phrase, pioneer spirit, often conjures bravery and independence, but in reality it was patience, the patience to keep repeating the same dull tasks that made settlement possible. Clearing fields, hauling water, building fences, repairing tools. These were not exciting acts, but they built the legend of perseverance. Later generations, looking back, turned these ordinary struggles into symbols of toughness. The cowhand riding the range was admired for his independence, but he spent most of his days mending fences, driving cattle slowly across miles of grass, or enduring storms in silence. His glory lay not in dramatic clashes, but in surviving the monotony chores. As family heritage, for many descendants of settlers, family stories were not about shootouts or duels, but about chores. Grandmothers remembered endless days at the washboard, scrubbing until their hands were raw. Grandfathers spoke of carrying water until their shoulders ached. Children learned pride not from tales of gold strikes or gun battles, but from the reminder that their ancestors endured what seemed unendurable: boredom, repetition, and toil. These stories passed down became lessons in endurance. They taught that hardship was not always grand or heroic, but quiet, grinding, and unnoticed. In this way, chores became part of family heritage, shaping values for generations. Work and the Western image, abroad the myth of the American West, spread beyond its borders, carried through dime novels, newspapers, and later films. To outsiders, the West looked like a land of freedom and wildness. Yet even in romanticized stories, the shadow of labor lingered. Tales of wagon trains spoke of hardship and weary travel. Accounts of ranch life, even when glamorized, mentioned the long hours of work under a burning sun. European immigrants who read of the West knew, often before they left their homelands, that it was a place where toil was constant. Many were not frightened by this, they were prepared for it. For some, the promise of land outweighed the burden of chores. Still, the myth and the reality remained tied together. A land of opportunity, yes, but only through labor. The quiet pride of ordinary survival. When people looked back on their lives in the West, few spoke with pride of their boredom or exhaustion. And yet, buried in their words was a kind of quiet satisfaction. To have raised children, to have kept a roof overhead, to have planted and harvested year after year. These were achievements as great as any battle. Survival was its own kind of glory. Each dull chore, repeated across thousands of days, added up to something larger than itself. The fact that families endured, that towns grew, and that communities survived storms, droughts, and disease all came from the accumulation of small acts of labor. The pride was quiet, but it was real. It is why, in old age, many pioneers spoke not of excitement, but of endurance. The myth after memories, time passed. The memory of these chores faded from public storytelling. The endless washing, chopping, carrying, and mending did not make for exciting novels or films. What remained instead were the simplified images: the cowboy with his lasso, the sheriff with his badge, the outlaw with his pistol. And yet, if you looked closely, even these myths carried shadows of work. The cowboy, after all, spent most of his life in the saddle, not in battle, but in labor. The lawman's dusty street was swept by the efforts of families who built and maintained the town. The outlaw's train robbery only mattered because of the goods, cattle, and crops produced by someone else's unending chores. The myth, in short, could not exist without the labor that supported it. The chores of the frontier may not have made it into the spotlight, but they remained the stage upon which all other dramas were performed. The legacy today of now, long after the frontier closed, echoes of those chores remain in cultural memory. The American ideal of hard work, the respect for endurance, and the quiet admiration for those who keep going no matter what, all find their roots in the dull repetition of Western chores. Modern life, with its machines and conveniences, may hide the monotony of survival. Yet, in every story of determination, in every phrase about earning your place or toughing it out, the shadow of the frontier's chores lingers in a sense. The settlers' endless labor shaped not only their survival, but the values of a nation. The chores of the West, boring and unglamorous though they were, built a cultural legacy that outlived the frontier itself. Closing reflection: the West was not won by adventure alone. It was carried forward, bucket by bucket, stitch by stitch, plow by plow. Chores defined the rhythm of life, wore down the body, and tested the spirit. But they also held communities together, built families, and created a culture that found pride in endurance. The myth of the West may be filled with stories of drama and danger, but its true foundation lay in boredom, in the patience to repeat the same tasks endlessly, without glamour and without praise. And so, when we think of the West, we might look past the gunfights and cattle drives, and instead imagine the quieter scenes: a woman scrubbing laundry at a creek, a man mending a fence in silence, a child carrying water under the sun. For it was these scenes, ordinary and uncelebrated, that built the world we now remember. Story 4. Sod houses and silent nights. Building a home on the plains. When settlers first arrived on the Great Plains, they stepped into a world that felt both vast and unforgiving. The horizon stretched in every direction with little to break. The view but waves of tall grass, bending in the wind like an endless ocean. For those who had left wooded lands behind, where timber was plentiful, the emptiness was startling. Here there were no trees to cut for cabins, no easy shelter to be found. Instead, the land offered something else: sod building. A life on the plains began with the simple, desperate question: where will we live? And the answer, as unlikely as it seemed, was to cut into the soil beneath their feet. The challenge of shelter for settlers arriving in the mid-1800s, often encouraged by the promises of the Homestead Act of 1862, the first priority was a place to stay. The act granted 160 acres of land to those willing to live on and improve it, but the land was bare. There were few forests, fewer stones, and no lumber mills nearby. If you wanted a house, you would need to make it yourself from what the prairie offered at first. Many families lived in tents, wagon beds, or dugouts, crude shelters dug into the side of a hill or straight into the ground. These kept out the wind, but they were dark, damp, and uncomfortable. The sod house soon became the better alternative. A sod house, or soddy, was made from blocks of earth cut from the prairie. The grass roots held the soil together like natural bricks, dense and surprisingly strong. Stacked carefully, these blocks could form walls thick enough to insulate against both summer heat and winter cold. The work of building imagine arriving at a new homestead, wagon creaking, your family weary from weeks of travel. There is no sawmill to provide planks, no town nearby to buy nails. The only building materials are the prairie itself, stretching under your boots. The work of cutting sod began with a spade or plow, carving the earth into strips about 3 feet long and a foot wide. These strips were then cut into bricks, heavy and awkward to carry, weighing as much as 50 pounds each. Settlers often used their own wagons to haul the bricks back to the chosen site for building. Walls were laid in staggered rows, grass side down, so that each block would settle firmly into place. Openings for doors and windows had to be carefully shaped, often reinforced with wood if it could be scavenged or traded. The roof might be made of more sod, laid over poles, or sometimes of canvas stretched tightly. It was back-breaking work. Hours upon hours in the sun, lifting heavy bricks, stacking, trimming, and adjusting. But at the end of it stood something remarkable. a house made entirely of earth, warm in winter, cool in summer, and strong enough to last for years. Living with the earth, the sod house was not a perfect home. It was practical, durable, and cheap, but also full of inconveniences. Inside, walls often crumbled slightly, leaving trails of dust and dirt across floors and furniture. Rain could sometimes seep through the roof, dripping into buckets set below. Snakes and insects found their way in through cracks, and mice often burrowed into the walls. Still, compared to a drafty tent or a hole in the ground, it felt like progress. The thick walls gave an eerie quiet, muting the howling winds of the prairie. On nights when the sky stretched endlessly above, scattered with stars, families gathered inside their sod houses with a lantern or small fire, listening to the muffled sounds of the plains. The silence was so vast it felt almost alive. For children, growing up in such a house meant learning to live with the earth itself, its smells, its textures, its intrusions. For parents, it meant the reassurance of shelter, even if imperfect. The sod house was not a dream, but it was survival. Community. In isolation, the first sod houses were often lonely. Neighbors might live miles apart, connected only by faint trails through the grass. Visiting another family meant hours of walking or riding across open land. In such isolation, the house became more than just shelter. It was a fortress of sorts, a place to withdraw from the vastness of the plains. Over time, as more settlers arrived, clusters of sod houses formed small communities. They stood like earthy outposts against the emptiness, each one a mark of human persistence. Together, they created the beginnings of towns, though at first they were little more than scattered shelters across the prairie. The psychological weight beyond the physical demands of building. There was a mental struggle. For many settlers, the endless horizon was overwhelming. Coming from wooded valleys or European villages, where stone, timber, and bustling life provided a sense of order, the plains seemed alien. To look out each day and see only grass, only sky, could create a strange loneliness. The sod house, crude as it was, offered a sense of boundary, walls that marked a space as home. Crossing the threshold from grassland to sod interior gave families a small feeling of security. Inside was their world. Outside was the vast unknown. This psychological comfort mattered as much as physical shelter. The sod house was not only a defense against storms and wind, but a defense against despair, an unfinished beginning. The sod house was rarely permanent. Many families dreamed of building wooden houses once they could afford lumber, or once railroads brought in supplies. But for years, sometimes decades, the soddy remained the heart of frontier life. Each sod house told the same quiet story. A family had arrived, faced the emptiness, and carved shelter from the earth itself. It was the first step toward permanence, even if temporary. And yet, one must ask, what did it feel like to lie in bed within those thick, earthen walls, listening to the muffled wind, wondering if this strange, heavy house could truly become a home? The sod house was not simply a shelter. It was a world unto itself, shaping the daily rhythms of those who lived inside. Once the hard labor of stacking sod blocks was done, the true challenge began, learning to endure life within walls of earth. The lightless interior step inside a sod house and you would notice immediately how dim it felt. With thick earthen walls and small windows, sometimes no more than narrow slits, sunlight barely filtered through. Many sod houses had only one or two windows, covered with oiled paper instead of glass, because glass was a rare and costly luxury. The result was a perpetual twilight inside, even during the brightest afternoons. A single kerosene lamp might light the room in the evenings, its glow faint and smoky, casting heavy shadows along the dirt walls. Families learned to live in half-light, their eyes adjusting to the dimness, their work slowed by the lack of brightness. For children, this dimness became normal, but for adults who remembered brighter homes in other places, it carried a constant sense of heaviness. The soddy protected them, yes, but it never truly welcomed them with warmth. The floors beneath their feet floors were often just packed earth, swept daily with brooms made from dried grasses. In some homes, settlers laid boards or brought in planks salvaged from wagons, but most families walked directly on hardened dirt. Over time, the earth floors compacted into a smooth, hard surface, but cracks often opened, letting in dust, insects, and the occasional creeping snake. During the wet seasons, the ground could become damp, even muddy, beneath bare feet. In dry weather, dust stirred with every step. Housewives fought a constant battle against this intrusion of nature, sweeping and sprinkling water on the floors to keep the dirt down. The ever-present dust was the true inhabitant of the sod house. Fine particles flaked constantly from walls and ceilings, drifting into food, clothing, and bedding. No matter how much a family cleaned, the dust returned, settling like a pale blanket on every surface. Meals were eaten with grit between one's teeth, bread speckled with soil, milk carrying the faint taste of earth. A stew simmering over the fire might be flavored not just with beans or potatoes, but with falling clumps from the ceiling. Children learned quickly to shake their blankets before sleep and cover dishes tightly. Mothers often stretched muslin or cloth beneath the roof to catch falling dirt, though it sagged under the weight of moisture and crumbled earth. Dust was not a nuisance to be defeated, it was simply part of life. Sounds of the soddy, though. The sod walls muted the endless prairie wind. The house was never truly silent. You might hear mice rustling within the walls, scratching faintly. Insects buzzed and crawled in the dim corners. Sometimes a snake, drawn by warmth or the scent of mice, slipped across the floor at night. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries muffled but still eerie through the thick earth. Rain pattered softly when it seeped into the sod roof, dripping steadily into placed buckets. Life in the sod house was accompanied by a strange mix of muffled stillness and unsettling noises, a reminder that the walls were not barriers, but part of the living land. The furniture of necessity inside, furniture was sparse and practical. A rough table, hand-hewn chairs, a wooden chest, and beds made from rope or slats with straw mattresses were common. Quilts, lovingly pieced from scraps of cloth, added the only touches of color to otherwise brown and gray interiors. Shelves were sometimes built directly into the sod walls, carved niches to hold crockery, books, or lamps. Everything had to serve a purpose. There was no room for excess. A soddy was not a place for display, but for survival. Cooking was done on a cast iron stove, if one could be afforded. Otherwise, over an open fire. Smoke sometimes clung to the ceiling, leaving a blackened stain that mixed with falling dust, giving the air a permanent heaviness. Weathering the seasons indoors despite its inconveniences, the sod house had advantages. The thick walls insulated remarkably well, keeping out the harshest winds of winter and the blazing heat of summer. On the coldest nights, a small fire and layers of quilts could keep a family safe from frostbite. In the hottest summers, the soddy remained cool and dark, a refuge from the punishing sun. But the soddy also carried dangers. During heavy rains, roofs leaked or even collapsed. In some cases, sod houses became so damp that mushrooms grew along the walls, sprouting in corners where moisture lingered. Winters, though warmer inside than outside, still brought drafts through gaps in the walls. Snow sometimes drifted in under doors or through cracks, leaving white patches along the floor. The role of the soddy in family life, for all its challenges, the soddy created a kind of closeness. Families lived in single-room dwellings, with no divisions of privacy. Parents, children, and sometimes hired hands all shared the same space. Sleeping in corners, eating at the same table, and listening to the same faint sounds of the prairie outside. This closeness bred both comfort and strain. In long winters, confined for weeks by blizzards, tempers could flare. The walls seemed to close in, the dimness deepening. But at the same time, this intimacy forced cooperation, teaching families to share, to endure, and to rely on one another. The psychological weight of the soddy living in a sod house was more than physical endurance. It was a test of the mind. The darkness, the dirt, the unrelenting closeness, these could wear on a person's spirit. Letters from settlers often speak of loneliness, of the oppressive quiet, of the longing for wood smoke rising from a cabin chimney, or the solid comfort of a stone hearth. And yet they endured. The soddy, humble as it was, gave families the foothold they needed to survive. Without it, many would have abandoned their claims. It was not a dream home, but a stepping stone, the first fragile structure in a life built on persistence. An ongoing question. So much of life inside the sod house was about compromise, comfort traded for survival, cleanliness sacrificed to necessity, privacy surrendered to family closeness. And yet, in those dim, dusty rooms, generations were raised and communities took root. But one wonders, as settlers sat in the half-light of their soddy, brushing dust from their plates, listening to mice scurry through the walls, did they imagine that one day their descendants would look back at these houses with nostalgia, calling them symbols of strength and resilience? Or did they simply dream of the day they could finally move into a house of wood and glass? The sod house, for all its sturdiness and necessity, was never meant to be permanent. It was a shelter of first resort, a home of survival rather than aspiration. As the decades passed and the frontier changed, the soddy gradually gave way to other forms of housing, wooden cabins, frame houses, and eventually the painted, gabled homes that came to symbolize settled life on the plains. This transition tells its own quiet story of how temporary endurance slowly turned into permanence, and how the marks of survival faded into the comforts of home. The arrival of lumber for settlers who had endured years in sod houses. The arrival of milled lumber was transformative. At first, boards were scarce, brought in at great expense by wagon or rail. Families might save for years to buy enough planks for flooring or shingles. Railroads, however, changed everything. As tracks spread across the prairie in the late 19th century, so too did access to lumber, nails, glass, and all the materials of civilized construction. What once had been a luxury, a proper wooden door, a pane of glass, or even wallpaper, became increasingly attainable. For many families, the first step away from sod was modest, a new wooden roof laid over the sod walls, or perhaps a single-room frame structure built beside the old soddy. Children often continued to sleep in the sod house, while the family began life in the new addition. The symbolism of the frame house, a wooden house, represented more than comfort. It stood as a declaration: we have made it through. Unlike the low, brown, nearly invisible soddy, a frame house stood tall against the prairie horizon. Its painted boards reflected sunlight, its windows glimmered with glass, its porch faced the world with confidence. It was both a shelter and a symbol of permanence, proof that the years of dust and darkness were behind them. 4 children raised in sod houses, stepping into a wooden home for the first time, could feel miraculous. The floors were smooth and raised. The windows opened wide to let in air and light, and the walls were dry and clean. Families spoke of the joy of sitting in a room without dirt falling from the ceiling, of eating bread untainted by dust. The fate of old Sadie's one families moved out. Sod houses rarely endured for long. Exposed to weather without repair, their walls softened and collapsed, roofs sagged, grass sprouted on the ridges, and soon the soddy melted back into the earth from which it had been cut. Travelers in the early 20th century sometimes came across mounds of earth where homesteads had once stood, little more than outlines of walls, half swallowed by prairie grasses. In this way, sod houses left almost no trace, dissolving into the landscape as if they had never been. Some settlers kept their sod houses as barns or storage sheds, even after moving into frame houses, using them until they crumbled. A few, lovingly preserved, survived into the modern era as monuments, though most vanished without ceremony. Memory and nostalgia. What is striking is how many settlers, later in life, spoke of their sod houses with affection. In memoirs and letters written long after, they described them not as places of misery, but as symbols of resilience. They remembered the laughter around a rough-hewn table, the warmth of quilts on winter nights, the closeness of family gathered together in a single room. They recalled the coolness of earthen walls in summer, the safety of shelter during howling storms, the way the soddy allowed them to begin a life where otherwise they might have failed. Time softened the memory of dust and darkness. The soddy became, in stories told to grandchildren, a badge of endurance, a reminder that before there was prosperity, there was struggle, and that the homes of earth made possible everything that came after, from survival to settlement. End of the sod house era marked the transition of the frontier from wilderness to settled land. As frame houses rose across the plains, schools, churches, and towns followed. The lonely, scattered soddies of the early homesteads gave way to communities linked by roads, rail, and commerce. What began as temporary survival became permanence. And with permanence came the sense of belonging. The prairie was no longer a place to endure, but a place to live. A closing thought. the sod house is often remembered now as a curiosity, a footnote in the story of the American West. But to the families who built them, they were far more than that. They were proof that humans could bend even the harshest landscape to survival, carving homes from the very soil beneath their feet, though they crumbled back into the ground. Their memory lingers, not in boards or beams, but in the stories of persistence passed down through generations. And perhaps that is fitting, for sod houses were always more about endurance than about permanence. They were the quiet beginning of lives that would grow far beyond their earthen walls. Story 5. Sickness on the trail. Ordinary illness. Extraordinary loss. When we think of the dangers of the Old West, the imagination often turns to outlaws, duels, or sudden ambushes. Yet, for the majority of families making their way across the plains or establishing homesteads, the greatest threat was not violence at all. It was sickness. The frontier, for all its open skies and wide horizons, was a place without the comforts of medical care, without nearby doctors or stocked pharmacies. Here, illness was both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary in its constant presence, extraordinary in its ability to reshape lives overnight. The common killers for families journeying westward. Some of the most feared illnesses were the most mundane: measles, whooping cough, influenza. Diseases often considered routine in cities could sweep through wagon trains with devastating effect. Diarrheal diseases, broadly called the flux at the time, were especially deadly. Without clean water or proper sanitation, outbreaks of dysentery or cholera could spread rapidly among travelers. A contaminated stream might bring sickness to dozens of wagons, leaving the trail lined with hastily dug graves. Fevers, too, were constant companions. Malaria haunted the river valleys. Typhoid claimed lives in settlements where latrines drained into drinking water. And tuberculosis, the dreaded consumption, lingered everywhere, its slow wasting a shadow over young and old alike. Medical knowledge and its limits. Doctors, when available, were few and often poorly trained. Frontier medicine relied heavily on home remedies, herbs, poultices, teas, and a deep faith in rest and resilience. Settlers carried with them little boxes of patent medicines, with names like Dr. Jane's tonic or Swaim's panacea, filled with alcohol, opium, or bitter herbs. Bleeding, blistering, and purging were still recommended by some practitioners, though these methods often left patients weaker than before. The most effective treatment was often the simplest: clean water, boiled food, fresh air, and rest. But these were luxuries in the harsh rhythm of frontier life, where moving wagons forward or tending crops left little time for convalescence. Children and vulnerability, the youngest, were the most vulnerable. Childhood diseases that might pass with mild discomfort in towns could prove deadly in the wilderness. Measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria took countless young lives. Parents often described entire wagon trains draped in silence after a wave of illness swept through, leaving small graves behind in the soil. Mothers carried immense fear, watching for the first signs: a child's cough, a rash on the skin, a sudden fever. With no physician nearby, the burden of care fell on their hands. Many kept detailed notebooks of symptoms, remedies tried, prayers whispered. Whether these efforts succeeded or failed often felt like a matter of chance. The spread of cholera, The deadliest of trail diseases was cholera, especially during the height of westward migration in the mid-1800s. Cholera came suddenly, with vomiting and watery diarrhea draining the body of fluids in hours. Entire families could be struck at once. Travelers feared the very sight of its approach. Accounts from diaries speak of camps where dozens fell sick in a single night, and burials were so frequent that graves stretched in long lines beside the trail. Those who survived often walked in silence afterward, deeply aware of how fragile their journey had become. The disease was carried by water, but at the time, the concept of microscopic germs was only beginning to be understood. Many settlers believed cholera arose from bad air or divine punishment. They fled camps where illness had broken out, unaware that the true danger lay in the very streams from which they drank. The emotional tollness was not only a physical trial, but also an emotional one. Families spoke of the loneliness of sickness. On the frontier, the isolation of watching a loved one fade while surrounded only by the endless plains. Unlike in towns or cities, where neighbors and doctors might gather, illness on the trail was born with little outside help. Sometimes, a wagon train would stop for days to allow recovery, but more often, the relentless pace of travel demanded that sick wagons press forward, jolting across rough ground even as patients groaned in fever. Burials were swift and quiet. A mound of earth, a wooden marker, if time allowed, and then the wagons moved on. Survivors carried grief with them, knowing there would be no chance to return, no lasting headstone, only memory, an open ending to the settlers who lived through it. Sickness was as constant a part of frontier life as the wind and the dust. Yet in its ordinariness lay its terror, the knowledge that even the smallest fever could shift the course of a journey, or a family's future, in an instant. And as you think of those wagons rolling slowly west, with children coughing beneath canvas covers and parents clutching bottles of bitter medicine, you may wonder, how did ordinary families continue on, carrying such fear and such loss, and still find the strength to keep moving toward the horizon? If illness was a constant on the frontier, so too were the efforts to treat it. The settlers who traveled west, or who settled far from established towns, could not rely on trained physicians or stocked apothecaries. Instead, they leaned on resourcefulness, on memory, and on the knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Remedies, though sometimes ineffective by modern standards, represented both hope and persistence. The role of folk medicine: most families brought with them a bundle of folk remedies, recipes passed down through mothers, grandmothers, or community. Healers' plants were gathered along the trail or grown in small gardens by homesteaders. Willow bark, known for its pain-relieving qualities, was boiled into tea for fevers and aches. Peppermint leaves eased stomach troubles, while onion poultices were pressed against the chest to fight coughs. Garlic, vinegar, honey, and salt were household essentials. Honey was not only sweet, but believed to soothe throats and disinfect wounds. Vinegar washed fevers from the skin. Salt was precious, used in gargles, in food preservation, and in wound care. Travelers spoke of carrying medicine bags, simple pouches filled with herbs, dried roots, or small vials of tinctures. Even if the remedies could not cure, they gave families a sense of action, something to do while waiting, something to try in the face of helplessness. Patent medicines and traveling peddlers, by the mid-19th century, commercial patent medicines became popular, carried west in bottles with bold labels and extravagant promises. Dr. Hosteter's bitters, Ayer's cherry pectoral, and Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup could be found in trunks and wagons. These concoctions often contained high amounts of alcohol, laudanum, a form of opium, or chloroform, which dulled pain but rarely cured disease. Still, in a world without reliable doctors, settlers clung to them. A spoonful of bitters might calm a stomach, or at least provide warmth and comfort on a cold night. Traveling peddlers sold these cures at inflated prices along the trail or in frontier towns. Their wagons, painted with bright slogans, were often a welcome sight, not because their medicines worked miracles, but because they represented contact with the wider world, a lifeline of hope against despair. Nursing at home care fell most heavily on women. Mothers, wives, and daughters were the frontline nurses of the frontier. They bathed fevers, brewed teas, washed wounds, and sat beside the sick with endless patience. Without thermometers, fever was measured by touch. Without stethoscopes, breathing was listened to by ear. Comfort was often the greatest medicine. A damp cloth across the forehead, a hand held in the night, or the reassurance of whispered prayers. Frontier nursing was not only about herbs or patent bottles, but about presence. Families believed that a watchful eye could keep death at bay, that vigilance itself had healing power. Community support, though the trail could be isolating. Illness often revealed the quiet solidarity of travelers. Wagon trains sometimes pooled resources, one family lending a little vinegar, another sharing herbs, another offering a strong back to dig graves if needed. In settlements, neighbors were the lifeblood of survival. A woman might cross miles of open prairie to sit with a sick neighbor's child, or to help with cooking and chores while the family focused on recovery. Communities formed watch nights, taking turns staying awake to guard the ill from worsening symptoms. Church congregations also played a role, offering prayer circles and communal fasts. Illness was rarely faced alone, even in the loneliest reaches of the West. Small victories, despite the harshness of frontier medicine, many illnesses were survived. A child recovered from scarlet fever. A husband overcame a broken limb that healed. With time, a mother's cough lessened after weeks of care. Every recovery was a triumph. Every return to health, a reminder that survival was possible. Families celebrated such moments quietly but deeply, often attributing the outcome to both God's mercy and the steadfastness of their own efforts. The journals of settlers are filled with notes of gratitude. My son is well again. The fever broke in the night. The Lord has spared us. These small victories offered hope, proof that persistence could outlast suffering. The burden of care but care came at a cost. Women already burdened with cooking, sewing, tending livestock, and raising children often wore themselves thin. Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, became a silent illness of its own. Caregivers wrote of long nights without sleep, of their own health breaking under the strain. Some died not from disease, but from depletion, their bodies worn down by years of tending others. On the trail, when one caregiver fell ill, the weight of responsibility shifted quickly. Older children were called to act as nurses, or neighbors stepped in. But the absence of a single caring hand could change a family's Fate, the question that remains frontier medicine, was fragile, improvised, and often inadequate. Yet through herbs, patent bottles, prayer, and care, families found ways to endure. Their remedies did not always heal, but they kept alive the spirit of persistence. And as you picture a wagon halted on the prairie, smoke rising from a small campfire where herbs are boiling in a tin pot, you might wonder, in a world where death was always near, how did people find the courage to keep treating the sick, knowing their efforts might fail, and yet never stop trying? Illness on the frontier was never just a passing event. It left imprints far deeper than the fevers and coughs themselves. In the silence that followed sickness, families carried memories, grief, and a sharpened awareness of life's fragility. For those who lived through epidemics or bore witness to loss, the effects stretched on across months, years, and even generations. The unmarked graves of the West, one of the most enduring shadows of frontier illness, lay in the countless graves scattered along the trails. Families could not carry the dead with them, and so they left their loved ones behind, buried in shallow earth, marked by hastily carved wooden crosses, or, sometimes, by nothing at all. Travelers on the Oregon Trail often spoke of passing grave after grave, sometimes freshly dug, sometimes already weathered by the wind. A mound of stones, a board with initials scratched into it, or a child's favorite toy left as a marker. These were the resting places of those who had fallen to cholera, dysentery, typhoid, or fever. The living rarely had time to mourn. Wagons had to move on, cattle had to be tended, miles had to be covered, and so grief was carried silently, tucked into memory. Each grave a reminder of what survival cost. Children left behind, perhaps the deepest scars were left on children. Young ones who lost parents had to grow up quickly, thrust into work beyond their years. Orphans sometimes traveled with neighbors, or were taken in by distant relatives in settlements. Some recorded memories decades later, speaking of how sickness had reshaped their childhood. They remembered the smell of vinegar on the air, the sound of whispered prayers by firelight, or the aching loneliness after a parent's voice fell silent. Even those who survived illness often carried its mark. A fever that spared life might leave a weakened body, or a limp that endured into adulthood. Childhood itself was often interrupted, reshaped by the long reach of disease. Faith and meaning. Faced with so much loss, many settlers turned to faith as a way to endure. Ministers preached that illness was a test of endurance, or that death on the trail was part of a divine plan. Prayer was not only a plea for healing, but also a framework to make sense of suffering. Hymns sung at gravesites echoed in the wind across prairies. Families prayed not only for the recovery of their own, but for the strength to continue westward, to find in new land some form of redemption for the losses behind them. Yet faith was not universal. Some settlers wrote of doubt, of questioning, why so many children died, or why good families were struck down while others remained untouched. For them, illness was not only a physical battle, but a spiritual reckoning. Resilience as legacy, and yet, through illness and loss, a remarkable resilience took shape. Families who survived learned to live with the memory of sickness, shaping their communities with vigilance. Settlements built in the West often prioritized clean wells, church hospitals, and stronger community bonds. Women who had learned nursing by necessity became midwives, healers, and caretakers for others. The hardships of illness on the trail created traditions of care that lasted beyond the journey itself. Recipes for herbal teas, methods of nursing, and stories of endurance were passed down not as tragedies but as lessons. Children grew up remembering not only loss but also the steadfastness of their mothers and fathers in the face of relentless suffering. The quiet weight of memory years later. Many pioneers looked back on the West not only as a story of opportunity, but as a memory shaped by sickness. Letters from the elderly to their grandchildren often spoke of those we lost on the way. Diaries, written in dim light, carried lists of names, etched carefully so that no one would be forgotten. For many, survival itself carried a strange burden. To live when others had died was to walk with ghosts, to recall the touch of fevered hands that had slipped away. Yet those same memories were the thread that bound communities together, a reminder that life was precious because it was fragile. Reflections beyond the West. Stillness on the frontier may seem distant now, buried beneath modern medicine and cities built on the land where wagons once rolled. Yet the questions it raised remain familiar. How do people endure loss? How do families survive when medicine is scarce and hope is fragile? The settler's story is not only about hardship, but about the persistence of care, of love expressed in poultices and prayers, of resilience born from sorrow. Their legacy is not found in monuments or great battles, but in the quiet strength of families who kept moving forward despite grief. A final thought as you imagine the prairie at dusk, a wagon fading into the distance, and a small wooden cross left behind in the tall grass. You may feel the stillness that illness left in its wake. The frontier was not only a land of open skies and vast horizons, it was also a land of loss and of the fragile, stubborn will to keep living. And so one question lingers, softly but persistently, in our own age of medicine and abundance. Do we still carry the same patience, the same resilience that allowed ordinary families to survive when sickness shadowed every step of their journey west? You've been listening to Boring Past Times. The Old West was not a place of endless adventure, but of small, ordinary struggles, the kind that shaped lives in silence. As you drift deeper into rest, may these stories remind you of the resilience of the past and the quiet patience that still lingers in history's forgotten corners. Thank you for joining, and until next time, may your dreams be peaceful.